Okay, welcome to lesson 11 in the Ends of the Earth, our study of the latter half of Rome. We're in Acts 27 and 28 tonight. So we're almost to the end of the story. We'll go to halfway through 28. Last week, we saw Paul standing trial before Felix, Festus, and Agrippa. So what stood out to you from those stories? There's only a few of us, so, everybody gets to talk more.
Paul was never guilty. He was always just held for his own protection or because as a favor to the Jews.
Yeah, never guilty and yet never released. Yeah, what were you going to say, Terry?
Oh, just the echoes of Pontius Pilate and Jesus, and always, the Jews are like, take care of this, and they're like, take care of him yourself. It's your law, and it's this back and forth of, no, you have to do it. And wasn't it ultimately like partly because he was a Roman citizen that he got to?
Yeah, well, it was his Roman citizenship that allowed him to appeal to Caesar. Yeah, good point. So a couple of good points in there. That sort of contrast between true justice and both Israel's justice and Roman justice, right? That really stood out as a failure and a lack of proper justice to Paul, because he was. They even said to each other, this man has done nothing wrong. We could have released him yet, but over and over again, they didn't release him. And so we saw how their greed and wanting a bribe or their political machinations, all of that played into this lack of justice for Paul, in contrast to what God, what he promised of God for the future, right? And then, your point about his Roman citizenship, that kind of he used that to turn the story. And God said, I want you to go to Rome. I want you to testify there to me, just as you've testified here. And so that privilege that Paul had ended up, pointing him toward the path that God had for him. And then we also, we talked about how this was it was the sort of speech climax of Acts, where Paul delivers his defense, which is a testimony to the good news for all people, and the understanding of God's plan had always pointed to this, and his idea that short time or long, he wishes for all people to be like him, except for these chains. That's kind of the high point of how that ended. Other thoughts or comments from last week? I'm going to pause just a second. Hold on just a personal item. Okay, so let's go into the text for this week. Let's read Acts 27. Would someone read verses 1 through 12, please?
I will. Paul sails for Rome. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium.
Good job. I don't really know.
about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia. And we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed
this one had all the hard names in it.
We landed at Myra in Lucia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty traveling off Cnidus. When the wind would not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salamon. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing southwest and northwest.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we know that Paul has longed to go to Rome for years now. When we read of his decision to go to Jerusalem in 1921, he says he resolved in the spirit to go to Jerusalem after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, "After I have been there, I must also see Rome." So back then, it seems like he thought he'd be going right after this quick trip to Jerusalem. But then on the way to Jerusalem, he starts getting the sense that it's not really going to go that way. And in fact, it does not go that way. And instead, he's been languishing in prison for more than 2 years because of these failures of Roman and Jewish justice. And so now he's finally on the way to Rome. And this is now becomes, because of the legal requirements of his appeal to Caesar, it becomes the responsibility of the Romans to get him there, right? So who is in the sailing party?
Is it Luke? Because there's a lot of we.
Yeah, Luke is with him, which is interesting, right? He is a prisoner, but Luke is along. And who else?
Julius.
Okay, so yes, Julius is a centurion. So this would be a commander of nominally a group of 100. This is a ranking position for a Roman soldier. It says he is, your translation will either say of the imperial regiment or the Augustan cohort. Augustan is more literal. It's like, this is the group of the regiment that directly reports to and protects the emperor, the Caesar. But they had little auxiliary units spread out in multiple places. We have archaeology that puts them in different cities, not just in Rome. And so Julius may have been stationed at Caesarea at this point, and escorting a prisoner was an important job that normally went to someone of a centurion rank. Okay, so Julius is in charge of the soldiers, and there are other soldiers, it says, and then who else?
Well, there's a pilot and the owner of the ship.
Yeah, I mean, is there someone else in Paul's party that we're missing? I feel like.
Yeah, so there's, I heard, and then what did you say, Aaron?
Are you looking for Aristarchus?
Okay, so there's both of those, right? There's other prisoners, right? So there's other soldiers that are taking other prisoners. And this word for others means others of a different kind. It's hetero, others. So they may have already been convicted. They may not be citizens. We don't know, but in some way they don't have the same standing that Paul has. And then Aristarchus is Paul's friend and a brother in Christ. And we know a few things about him. In chapter 19, remember when they were in Ephesus and there were 2 people that were caught up in that whole just mob of people going into the theater? Aristarchus was one of the 2 of Paul's brethren that was caught up in that mass of people. So we know he's been with Paul for a long time. When Paul writes Colossians, which 2 possibilities for the writing of Colossians, it may have been from Rome after this sea voyage, but it may also, and this idea kind of lends towards it may have been from Ephesus during whatever bad event that had Paul despairing even of life, whatever that bad event was, if it was an imprisonment, then it makes sense that Paul mentions Aristarchus as his fellow prisoner from that time. So it may be, it have been that, whatever legal charges the silversmith guild, remember, they were the ones who were mad at Paul, whatever legal charges they brought, the city clerk comes in and says, you got a problem, to handle it legally. All right, so that may have all gone against Paul and Aristarchus, and they may have been imprisoned in Ephesus together. So this is a companion of Paul. We also see in Acts 20, he's part of the collection party that was accompanying Paul. Remember, there were so many of them, and we think like, well, maybe once the money gets delivered, they're going back to their communities and say, yes, it went where we said it would go. But he's accompanying Paul. So Luke and Aristarchus, at least, are Paul's friends along with him. And it may be that they are there to tend to his needs, because Romans kept their prisoners from escaping. They didn't feed them or attend to their needs. And so Luke and Aristarchus may have been doing that on the journey with him. And they will, endure all of this hardship that we see coming in order to go with him and to care for him. Okay, so let's look at the sailing details. A ship going to Rome would normally go down to Alexandria on the north shore of Egypt. And I'm going to pull up a map in a minute, and then on to Rome. But this ship has this home port of Adramyttium, or however that is pronounced. Okay, so I was confused by this. I was like, how are they boarding from Adramyttium? It's the way it's worded. It makes it sound like they got on at Adramyttium. No, the ship was from Adramyttium, and it's going to return to Adramyttium. So that is a city near Troas. So that's the kind of the western coast of modern day Turkey. So it's a big enough metropolis that they, if they go all the way there, they would find a ship going to Rome from there. But they take this northern route because this is the ship they book. So they go straight north first. And where is their first stop? Just the next day.
Sidon or Sidon or...
Yeah, Sidon, we see this is only a day's journey north of Caesarea. Paul has been through there many times as he journeys back and forth to Jerusalem. He's gone through. He knows the brothers there. So what happens when he's in Sidon?
He gets to meet with the church.
Yeah. How come? He's a prisoner.
Julius let him do it.
Yeah, and he was probably accompanied by a soldier, either Julius or someone Julius dispatched to do that. But he goes so they can tend to his needs, and he does this as a kindness or a consideration. So we're kind of foreshadowing a respect and consideration that's going to show up later in the story, right? He visits his friends, the church there, may have given him the supplies he would need to eat, and Luke and Aristarchus that they would need to eat during the journey. Okay, so after Sidon, they start west, and here is the map. Always interesting to look at the map. So it started in Jerusalem. Trials were here in Caesarea. They do a little sail up to Sidon. Okay, and then now they're going to take this northern route across, right? Alexandria is on the north shore of Egypt, but they're going to go across and then over to Rome. So notice your translations may say they went north of Cyprus, or literally this is to the lee of Cyprus, the lee being the sheltered side. So the prevailing winds, this is, so the plot point that is being pointed to by all this geography is this is a difficult direction to sail at this time of year. The winds were westward, so the winds are coming out of the west and preventing this travel west. And so they go around to the sheltered side of Cyprus. These are the same winds that when Paul was trying to make his journey before and they went to the south of Cyprus, they had such good winds and made good time. And got there before the feast, right? But now they're going against the wind. So they come on this side and then they just creep along the coast. They're trying to get far, and we can tell that it goes quite slowly. When they get to Cindus or Kindus here, the critical thing about this is they're about to lose that shelter of land, right? They've been going along along the coast, but no coast here. So, they don't want to take up the whole Aegean Sea route. Instead, they're going to lose the shelter of land. So when they get there, they decide to switch ships. They find a ship coming from Alexandria. Okay, this makes perfect sense. This is one of those places when scholars get really excited about how much sense this story makes with regard to the historical and archaeological evidence we have of that time. Egypt grew much of the grain for the Roman Empire. And that was what was so important about Egypt and what we would call the Middle East today, is they were the breadbasket of the empire. They would grow all this grain. And so ships would very often come from Alexandria, come straight north up here and then make their way west, because again, it's against the wind and it gave them more room to get across. Grain was so important that, the Rome itself didn't have enough food production for their population, and they were always having to pull in grain. And it was important enough that even though sailing closed for the winter, they still needed grain for the winter. And so they would pay a premium price for grain that arrived late in the season. That someone could still get it there, they could make a killing on their grain, right? They got extra price. This had started in the reign of Claudius, so that they have all this motivation. Let's go anyway, even though it's getting late in the year. Questions or comments on that? Okay, so they creep along, they're losing time. When they set out from there on this new ship, this Alexandrian ship, they can't seem to go west, and they end up having, the wind is against them, they have to go south and around to the more sheltered side of Crete. So they end up going on the south side of Crete, and they end up at this harbor called Fair Havens. Okay, so by now, what time of year is it? Verse 9.
Is it winter?
It's getting closer, because winter is the time when it's not. From early November on, sailing is completely impossible, and in late September and October, it's dangerous.
The Day of Atonement, isn't that Rosh Hashanah?
It is
Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur. Thank you.
It is. It's Yom Kippur. And so that is between mid-September and mid-October. Remember, they're on a lunar calendar, so it moves every year. But if this is 59 AD, as we think it probably is, then that would have been the 5th of October. So it's already mid-October. It's into the very late sailing season, right? And nobody sails after, by the beginning of November. So they know it's dangerous, and they're looking for a place to winter. And what does it say about wintering in Fair Haven?
Well, that it was unsuitable. You can't do it.
Yeah, and
would
the
go
owner
on?
doesn't want to, and the ship captain doesn't want to, right? So Fair Haven's a nice name for a harbor, but the harbor is small, and that's not the real problem. The real problem is the town is small and it's several miles away. Well, it mentions near the town of Lycia. This is a small town a few miles away, and so are they going to divide their group? Are some kind of people going to guard the ship? Are they going to go back and forth to this town? Does this town really have enough population and kind of business to support what ends up being 276 people? by the time, like for the whole winter, right? Are they going to be able to sell what they have to sell and buy enough food there? Or is it just such a small little town that they really can't support that many extra people? And so Paul speaks up. What is Paul's advice?
We should stay here.
Yeah, he's quite clear on that. He's a prisoner. Why is he speaking up?
Because it's
He always
Paul, and
speaks
Paul
up.
always does.
We really, his personality comes out over and over in this, doesn't it? Yeah. It's also like there's like, what is Luke doing with all of this geographical information, right? We don't know these places. And so we're just like, we're summing up in the names, or like this place, that place. The geographic information, if we know what it means, this is, this is like you're watching a show and you're like, oh, don't go down to the basement. This is the foreshadowing, right? This is like the sign that things are not going well. This is not going to end well. We're headed for trouble. And so Paul's speech is kind of the pinnacle of Luke's foreshadowing here, right? Like he is pointing towards, there's a dramatic indication that they are headed towards trouble. And Paul's advice becomes like the peak of that. In addition, Paul was a seasoned traveler, right? He has done a lot of traveling. We learned from his letters that he's already been shipwrecked at some other time. And he's crossed the sea. He's done this. And so he is willing to say, like, this is not worth it, people. And he has at least a respectful relationship with his guard, Julius. And then, he's confident in his wisdom as a man of God and in the wisdom that God and the discernment that God gives him. And so he speaks up, but of course it makes sense that the captain and the owner and his guard do not just agree to listen to the prisoner and stay in this unsuitable harbor. And so they decide to press on. Someone read 13 through 20 for us.
When a moderate south wind came up, supporting that they had gained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. But before very long, there rushed down the land a violent wind called Equator, whatever. And when the ship was caught in it, it could not face the wind. We gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along, and running under the shelter of a small island called Claudia, where we scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. And after they had hoisted it up and used supporting cables underground the ship, and fearing that they may not be able to run again on the shallows of Cyprus, they let down the sea anchor and so themselves be driven along. The next day, as they were being violently storm tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands, and since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, no small storm was assailing us. From then on, hope of our beginning saved that was gradually abandoned.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so they think this gentle south wind begins to blow and they think, oh, perfect. We can get around the corner to the next harbor. It's just such a short way. We're just going to hop on over to the next harbor, Phoenix, and we'll winter there. Incidentally, the coastline has changed. Phoenix is no longer a preferable harbor, but there's some indication that there's a change in the shoreline because of earthquake damage. So in that time, it was a preferable harbor, and they think we're just going to go And along comes this huge storm. It may say a wind of hurricane force. It's literally the Greek version of typhoon, our word typhoon. And they call it the northeaster. This is a storm, a pattern storm that still happens in the waters of Crete today. It's well known to be very severe, and they just have oars and sails, right? They don't have the options that modern ships have, and so they're just driven completely off course to the wind. Look at verse 16. They would have been towing the ship's boat, right? There would be a small oar-powered boat that they would take, into land if they were docked just off of land, or a lifeboat. It would be the small ship's boat. And at this point, it's probably swamped. It's probably like tugging underwater, and they're worried they're going to lose it, right? That the ropes won't hold it when it's full of water and they're having to tow it that way. And notice the first person here. He says, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So we can envision Luke maybe pressed into service, having to help tow this lifeboat in. All of the passengers would just sleep on the deck. They didn't have passenger rooms, right? This would have been like everybody's just there on the deck, and they pulling people, you there, help with the lifeboat, okay? Then verse 17, the skilled crew, they did this maneuver where they wrapped ropes around the ships to try to reinforce it. And this was normally done only in the harbor, and scholars are still arguing about how they could have done this at sea. But the Greek says with the use of helps. So it may be that they had some kind of equipment, the block and tackle, were able to help them wrap these ropes around during sea. Also, I noticed your translation said they lowered the sea anchor, but some will say the mainsail in verse 17, what they lowered. It's literally, they lowered the gear, right? It's the thing. They lowered the thing. So whatever the gear was, it could have been the mainsail, because as it has too much wind, the leverage could break it from the base of the ship, right? Or it could have been the sea anchor to add some stability. We see they do that later. These ships have lighter anchors than modern ships and more of them. So they have several anchors, and it may be that they lowered an anchor. You notice in verse 17, they begin to throw the cargo overboard. This would have been the deck cargo. It may have been deck furniture, extra stuff that some merchants brought along. It's not the grain yet, right? The fleet of grain ships primarily carries grain, and grain is the lucrative crop. They haven't abandoned the profit from the grain yet, right? They're throwing the deck cargo overboard, and then it says the tackle with their own hands. This is probably stuff that was lifted by hooks and pulleys when they're in port. And it would have been not stuff that they're used to having to pick up and move with their hands, but they're throwing it all overboard. Why are we getting all of this sailing detail? It is a lot of sailing jargon and a lot of sailing detail. Why is Luke telling us all this?
Maybe it was traumatic. And it's like, oh my gosh, all this happened and I have to tell you about all of it.
Yeah, right. I mean, it really rings true. Somebody he's gone through a thing, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think, what's that?
It was bad.
Yeah, there's a sense of authenticity here. Like a witness is living through all of this. He's day after day, he's on the boat. He's learning the sailing jargon by suffering through the sailing situation, right? And so all of this comes out. You can see this. It seems so much like when we go through something and we're saying this goes like this, and they had to do that. And so Luke's giving us his eyewitness version, and we get such a dramatic story out of it, right? They're throwing the tackle into the sea with their own hands, right? He's really building up what was surely a terrifying situation that's becoming more and more dire. So great writing here. So much, personal detail we hear coming through. Thoughts or comments on that? What would it have meant to them that they saw neither sun nor stars for many days?
They can't navigate. They don't know where they are.
Yeah. And it's vivid too, right? Not only kind of the dread of having no idea where they are, and these shallows of the coast of Sirtis, that was down in the coast of northern Africa. They have no idea where those shallows were quite a ways offshore, and so they have no idea where they are, and they're just like, we could be anywhere, we could run aground in shallows and we wouldn't even know it. So he's pointing out the strength of the storm and this long length of the storm and the oppression of the darkness, and then the uncertainty of their not being able to navigate. So it makes sense that he ends this little section with, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. Let's read 21 through 32.
Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred, sorry, and listen to me and incurred this injury and loss." I just turned the page. Now I have to do it again. There it is. That's what problem on the Kindle. I got excited and my thumb hit this thing. "You should not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.' When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go."
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so what is Paul's message? What does he start with?
I told you so.
I told you so, right?
Told you.
Classic, right? I like that Luke doesn't censor it out either, right? He tells us, like, we know this is Paul. He's Paul the Bold, and we get the full force of his personality here. But after that, what is his message?
"You did this, but take heart."
But take heart. Yeah, he's had a vision, right? So this would have been credible to some, not credible to others, right? They're wondering, what kind of vision does the guy in chains get to have, right? So, and they had to have been wondering, what God did we displease to end up where we've ended up? But he says, my God has promised that we will survive and has gifted him, this graciously given, has gifted him the lives of all who sail with him. So there seems to be, from the beginning of this little passage to the end of it, a requirement that they all stay together for this to work out. Verse 27, it's been 2 weeks of being driven by the storm. That's a terribly long time, isn't it? I mean, so many days. They would have been just living on the small amounts of whatever they could manage. The galley is not open. No one is making and delivering food. They may be sick from the storm. They're definitely anxious. So
I
not
bet they
really
had no
getting to
toilet
eat.
paper either.
What's that?
I bet they had no toilet paper either.
True story.
There might be some sanitation problems at this point. Yeah. So they've got, I mean, it's not been good. This has been hard days, really, really hard days. And the sailors begin to sense or surmise that they are getting near the land, and they took soundings. Literally, they heaved the lead. So, some kind of weighted line they would take down and see how deep it is. And what do they learn from the soundings?
They're
What's
coming
the
up.
progression?
Yeah.
Getting
it's getting
shallower.
shallow.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it's getting shallower. They think they're new land. They drop 4 anchors. Sometimes a ship would drop 1 anchor, and when it began to tear at the wood of the boat, or when the line began to break, they would cut it away and drop another. And they may do that in sequence. Or here, they may just drop the whole load and say, like, we'll lighten the ship, drop it all at once, just anything to try to get to daylight. Luke mentions that this is from the stern because it normally would have been from the bow. They normally would have put the anchor from the bow, but if they do that in this wind, it'll flip them around, and then will they be able to reposition to run aground on the sandbar? And so he mentions that it's done the other way. And meanwhile, what are the sailors in the bow doing?
They're getting off.
Right. They said every man for themselves at this point to them, right? They're like, vision or
Rats are
not,
running.
let's sneak away. Now, how do the soldiers regard Paul's advice? Pretty high confidence in Paul that they're willing to cut that lifeboat away, right? That lifeboat could have come in handy later, but they take his word for it and they cut it away. It's a desperate move to follow what Paul says so that they can keep the whole group together. Because unless the men stay with the ship, you cannot be. What does it say in verse 31?
You cannot be saved.
Saved.
Yeah, this word saved is the same word for salvation, right? It's the same as in 20. We gave up hope of being saved unless they stay, they cannot be saved. So there's this idea of Paul is promising them rescue. He's promising them salvation. What does this story of the storm at sea, what does this make you think of in terms of stories that they would know?
Makes me think of Jonah.
Yeah, right? Are they asking each other who's at fault that we're having this storm? Yeah. What else? I want to talk a little more about Jonah. There's a few more stories that I think this would kind of call out to.
I think too, Jesus on the storm, when there was a big storm and Jesus was asleep in the storm, and they were saying, Lord, 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 don't you know we're in a storm?
Do you not care that we're perishing? Yeah, Jesus is the only one who was at peace in the storm. And here Paul is the only one with this message of hope, as they are seemingly perishing, right? As they are giving up hope, Paul is the only one with this message of hope. Yeah, yeah. What about secular story from this time? The Greek culture.
Well, Poseidon's the god of the sea.
Yeah, even think about like the Odyssey, where this journey just goes on and they continue to meet the monsters, right? I think that Luke's writing here is sort of calling out to these few things. For the Jews, And for some of the other surrounding cultures, the sea, the waters are the place of chaos, right? In the creation story, the Spirit is hovering over the chaos water, and God brings order just with his word. But the sea is the place of chaos and disorder. It's the place where the monsters live. In Job, he talks about that's where the Leviathan is, this monster of the deep. When Jonah is cast overboard, it's only the great fish swallowing him that saves him from the Leviathan when he gives his poem. The monster of the deep is what's going to get him if you hadn't been swallowed by the great fish. Think about Noah's Ark, where the destructive power of the waters is what destroys almost everything that lives. The prophecy in Daniel 7, from which a later part of it is where we get this phrase, the Son of Man, the idea of the person of power coming in the clouds. Earlier in that chapter, we see these monsters coming up out of the sea, these 4 monsters that represent the 4 kingdoms of the earth. So the sea is it's the bad place. It's the place of chaos and monsters. It's a place of fear, and it's a representative of the forces of evil. So there's something like symbolic in this story about the power of evil and its worst attack that it can be, right? Paul stands up from this point, 33, Paul stands up and gives this exhortation to everyone who would hear him, right? Everyone who could hear. Just before dawn, Paul urged them. He said, "For the last 14 days, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food." The translation here is misleading. Mine says you need it to survive, but literally it is, "Now I urge you to take some food. It is for your salvation. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." And after he had said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Okay, what is this action of Paul with the bread remind us of?
Well, Jesus feeding thousands.
Yeah, that pattern. He took it, he blessed it, he broke it, he gave it. That is the pattern we see in the feeding of the 4,000 and the 5,000, and in the
Last Supper.
In the Passover, in the supper of the Lord, right? The breaking of the bread, right? So Paul says to them, it is for your salvation. There's a sense of worship and sanctification that is given to them as their salvation. It's coming. And so in this, it talks about like they all were encouraged. They ate, and there were 276. What do they do after they eat? Verse 38.
So when they toss the grain.
Yeah, they finally given up on that primary cargo, the money maker. They finally given up on the grain, and they toss it into the sea. Verse 39, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, and they decided to run the ship aground if they could. And cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground, and the bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest were to get there on planks or pieces of the ship. And in this way, everyone reached the land in safety. Okay, why are the soldiers going to kill the prisoners?
So I don't get away.
Yeah, their life would be forfeit. We've seen this multiple times, right? That this is the standard practice. But they seem to not only believe Paul, that they ought to stay together, but it says he wanted to spare Paul's life. And in this way, they all reach safety. Same word as being saved, only now it's got a prefix through. So it's through danger, salvation. So they all come through the waters, every one of them. You know, it's like a baptism, a passing through the sea, every person out of death into life, and so that they reach land. So Paul is not a Jonah, right? He's a reverse Jonah. What happens when they get on shore in Malta? Someone read for us verses 1 through 6.
Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw that the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he has escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Sorry, how far did you want me to read?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
You can stop there. So what happens with this?
Well, they want to make him an idol, like he was bit by a snake, and oh, something's bad because he got bit by a snake, and then there's no effects, and so, oh, well, you must be immune, you're a god. So
yeah, there's really a kind of a parallel. There is a legend at this time of a murderer who escaped the sea only to be bitten by a snake and die because of, the justice of fate, So we kind of get that same reversal here, right? Just like he's a reverse Jonah, he's a reverse whatever this character is. I don't know the name. So that he isn't under judgment for disobeying God, but he's under this grace, this gift from God as he lives out his work in obedience, right? The monsters are no match for him. This sort of symbol of evil has no effect on him, and this is the dramatic climax of the book, right? Just like we saw the speech climax of the book last week with these promises for all people, short or long time, to come to a knowledge of God. We see here we got this dramatic climax. Paul has gone through the storm, through the forces of evil, right? He has faced the monsters in obedience to God. He's faced the worst that darkness can do. We talked before about how in a lot of ways, Luke and Acts are sort of written on parallel tracks. So we get at the end of Luke, of course, we get the story of Jesus facing the powers of darkness, right? He faces the hour of darkness, and because of his obedience, his death and resurrection, the powers of darkness have been defeated. And so in the storm here at the end of Acts, there's this like darkness rages and does its worst, but the victory of Jesus is already won, and God just gifts Paul with their lives, out of his obedience. The salvation that is won on the cross is worked out through God's people living in obedience, facing the powers of evil. Out of this, the last little part of this chapter, there's a state nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island, and he welcomed us in his home and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. And they honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with all the supplies we needed. After 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. it seems to be, it was an Alexandrian ship with a figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. So this is probably another Alexandrian grain ship, another of the fleet of imperial grain ships. And it may have been stuck wintering there because of this same storm, right? So from there we set sail and arrived at Rhegium, and the next day a south wind came up, and the following day Puteoli, and there we found some brothers. So these are some Christians, and Paul has no way of knowing how far the gospel has reached outside Rome. He knows there's church in Rome because that is where, I almost said Ananias and Sapphira, Priscilla and Aquila are from, right? They were expelled from Rome. But these brothers came, and we got to spend a week with them, and so we came to Rome. The brothers there had heard we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the Three Taverns. This would have been like 2 days ride out. At the sight of these men, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. And when we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. So we have this whole journey towards Rome is finally completed, so that we have this whole sweep of the story ends with that arrival in Rome. And then next week we'll do kind of the denouement. Thoughts on this part of the lesson, any of it?
Well, I feel like we continue to see these echoes of Christ's, journey, and, not exactly the same, but a lot of similarities, and yeah.
Yeah, because Paul doesn't do anything for his victory, right?
Mm-mm.
Jesus has won the victory. Paul trusts and waits and encourages others, and he shares what he has, right? He goes, he heals the Father, and then he heals any islanders that come, and we know he's preaching because he's Paul, right? Yeah, his victory is sort of just given to him as assured. What are you thinking, Aaron? You had a thoughtful look.
Nothing very deep.
That's fine.
I was just thinking it's a long time to have held on to the same idea and to still believe that it was going to happen and to keep forging ahead towards the same dream. I mean, it's been years in Ephesus, and I mean, even this last trip was probably close to a year by the time that all happened. And, that's perseverance.
Yeah, they start out early enough that if it hadn't gone so slow, they would have made it before winter, right? And so it's like a whole, like they're sailing the fall, and then they have to winter over, and then they start out in the spring, and that's after the 2 years in prison in Caesarea, and that's after all these. Yeah, it's a long obedience in the same direction. That's a title of a book that was really long.
It was really long.
We studied once together years ago. It's a study on the Psalms, and it's repetitive is the thing about that book, and it's meant to be, apparently. And yeah, I think it's a great point. Paul had to have felt the weight of those years. Yeah.
It makes me think of a story of a friend that was telling a story. I'm trying to remember exactly how she put it, but it was like she was sitting in the outer circle of the campfire waiting to be in the inner circle of the campfire where things were happening, but sometimes you have to start because it's not that there's no space, but I don't remember why she used that analogy, but Paul always felt like he had a purpose. He never sat around waiting for his purpose. But why didn't he give up on his purpose? Because it's like the impatience of all of it. It's like, oh, it didn't happen this year. Oh, that must have been wrong.
And we know he had to have intended to. I mean, when he says, we despaired even of life, he had to have really felt those years of waiting pulling him down. Yeah.
And don't forget, people tried to tell him that he wasn't supposed to go too.
Yeah.
They gave him the option. They're like, no, no, the Spirit has told us you're not supposed to go.
He says, why are you weeping and breaking my heart? Yeah. Yeah. It mattered to him. It mattered to him that they were telling him this, right? I think it had to have mattered if he said those words. Yeah. Paul ends up being kind of the hero of the last half of the story, but in a way he's not at all the hero, right? He's the champion of the hero, right? There's this sense of everything to the service of Jesus, everything to the glory of God, everything pointing to the hope of Israel. And he seems to be able to hold on to that in the hard times. And he has a lot of them. And he's got more ahead, and he knows it. Yeah. Well, thank you. Enjoyed the discussion. Very good. Next week we'll finish the book, that last half of chapter 28. I keep saying next week, but it's not actually next week. Next week is Thanksgiving. We're off all week. And then it'll be the week after. So we'll meet the first week of December for our final lesson in this series. Thanks, everybody.
Amen.